For 22 years, an Arizona field geologist trusted science to explain everything he encountered in the wilderness. But when he discovered a hidden spring in Tonto National Forest, he found evidence of something the government has been hiding since 1977, that we are not alone in these forests, and everyone who's previously documented this has mysteriously disappeared, their records erased, their memories altered, and their warnings silenced. Now he's experiencing missing time, and he may be next.
Secrets of the Woods.
I've worked as a field geologist for the Arizona Geological Survey for nearly 22 years, specializing in groundwater systems and seismic activity. My job frequently takes me into remote areas of the state that most people never see. I've always prided myself on maintaining a rational, scientific approach to my work, and until recently, I'd never encountered anything I couldn't explain through natural processes. That changed during my most recent field assignment. On April 17th, I was dispatched to conduct a routine hydrological assessment in the northern section of Tonto National Forest, specifically around the Fossil Creek area. For those unfamiliar, Fossil Creek is a pristine waterway about 90 miles northeast of Phoenix, known for its travertine pools and remote wilderness setting. It's designated as a wild and scenic river, with limited access to protect the delicate ecosystem. My assignment was straightforward: collect water samples, document flow rates, and assess any changes to the creek's geological features since our previous survey in 2022. I arrived at the site around 10:30 a.m. and set up my base camp about a quarter mile from the creek's headwaters, where several springs emerged from the ground. The weather was clear, around 82 degrees with minimal wind, perfect conditions for fieldwork. I spent the day taking measurements and samples at predetermined points along a 3-mile stretch of the creek, working my way upstream toward the headwaters. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, and I finished my scheduled collections around 4:45 p.m. Since I was ahead of schedule and the light was still good, I decided to hike to an unmarked spring that wasn't on my official itinerary, but had been mentioned by a colleague who thought it might have unique mineral content. According to his coordinates, this spring was located in a small canyon about a half-mile northwest of the main headwaters, accessible via an unofficial game trail. I found the trail easily enough and followed it as it wound through increasingly dense vegetation. The terrain changed noticeably, becoming cooler and more humid, with an unusual amount of moss covering the north-facing rock surfaces. After about 20 minutes of hiking, I noticed something odd. The ambient noise of the forest had completely disappeared. No bird calls, no insect sounds, not even the rustling of leaves in the breeze. The silence was absolute and immediately unsettling. I checked my phone and saw no signal, which wasn't unusual for the area. My GPS unit was still functioning, showing I was approximately 200 yards from the spring's coordinates. As I continued forward, I began experiencing a pressure in my ears, similar to the sensation of diving too deep in water. My digital watch began flickering, and the display on my GPS unit became intermittently scrambled, showing coordinates that jumped erratically. About 50 yards further along the trail, I encountered a small clearing that wasn't visible until I was practically standing in it. In the center was a pool of water, roughly 50 or so feet in diameter. Unlike the blue-green waters of Fossil Creek, this water was unnaturally clear. So clear it was difficult to gauge its depth. The spring that fed it emerged from a crevice in the limestone wall of the canyon, but what caught my attention was the rock formation surrounding the spring. The limestone appeared to have been melted and solidified in a pattern that resembled flowing liquid frozen in time. I've seen similar formations created by extreme heat, but never in this particular geological context. More disturbing were the perfectly circular impressions embedded in the rock face, 7 of them, each approximately 11 inches in diameter, arranged in a precise heptagon pattern around the spring's emergence point. As a geologist, I can tell you with absolute certainty that these formations were not natural. They resembled tool marks, as if something had cored samples from the rock with incredible precision. Yet the edges showed signs of extreme heat vitrification, with the limestone partially transformed into a glass-like substance that would require temperatures exceeding 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit, far beyond what any forest fire could produce. I began photographing and measuring these anomalies, trying to maintain my scientific detachment despite growing unease. I collected a water sample from the spring and noted that, despite the afternoon temperature still being around 75 degrees, the water was unnaturally cold. My digital thermometer registered 34.8 degrees Fahrenheit, just above freezing. As I worked, I began hearing what I can only describe as rhythmic vibrations coming from beneath the ground. My first thought was seismic activity, but my instruments showed no readings. The vibrations followed a distinct pattern: 7 pulses, a pause, 5 pulses, a longer pause, then 3 pulses, before repeating. As someone familiar with Morse code from my military service years before my geology career, I recognized this wasn't random. It had the cadence of communication. I decided to complete my documentation quickly and return to my base camp. As I was packing my equipment, I noticed a distortion in the air above the pool, similar to heat mirage but more pronounced and localized. Through this distortion, the rock face on the opposite side of the clearing appeared to shift and waver, revealing what looked like a darkened passage or tunnel that I was certain hadn't been there moments before. At this point, my scientific curiosity was overwhelmed by a primal sense of warning. I left immediately, following my GPS back toward the main trail. As I moved away from the spring, my equipment gradually returned to normal function, and the forest sounds slowly returned. I reached my base camp just as dusk was settling and decided to break protocol by hiking out to my vehicle rather than spending the night as planned. I couldn't rationalize this decision with anything concrete. I simply knew I needed to distance myself from that location. Upon returning to Phoenix, I filed my official report, but omitted the anomalous spring and its features, instead focusing on the standard collection points. I couldn't risk my professional reputation by including observations I couldn't explain through conventional geology. However, I began researching the area's history in my off hours, looking for any reports of similar phenomena. What I discovered disturbed me profoundly. In reviewing Forest Service archives, I found a series of internal memos dating back to 1976, referencing site anomalies in the exact coordinates where I'd found the spring. These memos were heavily redacted, but several mentioned acoustic signatures and gravitational inconsistencies. Most concerning was a reference to a containment protocol established in 1977, following what was described only as the incident. This led me to investigate a case I'd previously heard mentioned only in passing: the disappearance of Paul Fugate, a park ranger who vanished from Chiricahua National Monument in January 1976. While Chiricahua is about 200 miles southeast of Fossil Creek, what struck me was a detail that appeared in only one early report, but was omitted from later documentation. Fugate had apparently been conducting research at multiple sites across Arizona, including Fossil Creek, in the weeks before his disappearance. I managed to locate a retired Forest Service employee named Michael Reeves, who had worked in the Tonto area during the late 1970s. I contacted him, claiming to be researching historical water quality data. When we met at a diner in Payson, his demeanor changed dramatically when I casually mentioned the spring northwest of the headwaters. He asked how I knew about that location, and I explained I'd stumbled upon it during fieldwork. Michael leaned across the table and told me in a hushed voice that the area had been unofficially off-limits to Forest Service personnel since 1977. He said that following Fugate's disappearance, a team of investigators from an unnamed federal agency had spent 3 weeks in that section of the forest. They'd brought specialized equipment that required a generator truck parked at the nearest accessible road. After they departed, all records of their findings were removed from local offices, and staff were instructed never to discuss the matter. What Michael told me next sent chills through me. He said 4 members of that investigative team had subsequently disappeared over the following 5 years. 2 went missing during unrelated field assignments in remote locations. 1 reportedly committed suicide, though his body was never found. The 4th was listed as having taken an immediate transfer to another agency, but when Michael had tried to contact him a year later for personal reasons, he discovered no record of the man existed in any federal employment database. Michael himself had once ventured near the spring in 1980, driven by curiosity about the restrictions. He described experiencing the same silence and pressure I had encountered. He'd also heard what he called the counting, rhythmic vibrations coming from underground. But what made him retreat immediately was seeing clear footprints in the soft earth near the trail, footprints that started abruptly, continued for approximately 20 feet, and then stopped just as suddenly, as if whatever made them had appeared and disappeared mid-stride. He said the footprints were humanoid, but with only 4 toes and measuring nearly 20 inches in length. After our conversation, I began searching through newspaper archives and found scattered reports of hikers experiencing unusual phenomena in that general area over the decades. Most described unexplained equipment failures, disorientation, and lost time. 3 separate accounts mentioned hearing mechanical humming coming from underground. Most disturbing were reports from 1988, 2003, and 2019 of hikers seeing what they described as people who weren't quite right, individuals observed at a distance who moved with unusual gaits and seemed to disappear when approached. I decided I needed more concrete information and reached out to Dr. Elena Barasetti, a bioacoustics researcher at Arizona State University. Without revealing the exact location, I described the rhythmic vibrations I'd experienced and asked if she had ever documented anything similar. Her response was unexpected. She'd been conducting a systematic study of unusual acoustic phenomena in the Tonto forest since 2022, focusing specifically on an area within 5 miles of Fossil Creek. We arranged to meet at her laboratory, where she showed me spectrograms of recordings captured at multiple sites around the forest. The patterns were immediately familiar to me, the same rhythmic sequences I had felt near the spring. Dr. Sandoval explained that these vibrations contained complex harmonics beyond the range of any known wildlife species or geological process. More significantly, The timing between vibration sequences followed mathematical patterns suggesting intentional communication rather than random natural phenomena. What truly unsettled me was when she played an actual audio recording that had been digitally shifted to bring the frequencies into human hearing range. The resulting sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard, partly mechanical, partly organic, with modulations that created an almost language-like cadence. She also shared a detail that connected directly to my experience. These acoustic anomalies were most active between 2:30 and 3:45 a.m. and appeared concentrated in a quarter-mile radius, centered on what her maps showed to be the exact location of the spring I had discovered. I asked if she had any theories about the source of these sounds. She hesitated before admitting that her preliminary analysis indicated the sounds originated from at least 80 feet below the surface, possibly deeper. Most concerning was her discovery that the frequencies demonstrated what appeared to be responsiveness to human activity, changing patterns when her team was present versus when only automated equipment was recording. Whatever was generating these sounds seemed aware of being monitored. As our conversation concluded, Dr. Sandoval mentioned something that connected to another aspect of my research. She said her team had documented significant electromagnetic anomalies correlating with the acoustic events. These EM spikes had been detected by equipment designed to monitor lightning strikes, but occurred even during clear weather with no storm activity. When mapped over time, these anomalies formed distinct geometric patterns centered on the same area. This information led me to investigate the unusual wildfires that had affected Tonto National Forest between May and August of 2024. Through a contact at the Regional Forest Service office, I gained access to internal reports not included in public releases. What I found defied conventional wildfire behavior. 5 major fires had started simultaneously at points forming a perfect pentagon, with the approximate location of the spring at its center. More disturbing was data showing these fires had burned at temperatures exceeding 2,300 degrees Fahrenheit in certain areas, significantly hotter than typical forest fires, and more than hot enough to melt the aluminum casings of Dr. Sandoval's recording equipment. I also discovered that in 3 instances, fire crews reported their communications equipment failing specifically when they approached certain areas within the burn zone. 2 firefighters were briefly hospitalized after experiencing what was officially recorded as heat-related disorientation, but which their personal accounts described as a period of missing time during which they had wandered nearly 3 miles from their assigned sector, with no memory of how they got there. The fire investigation reports listed all 5 ignition points as lightning caused, despite weather data showing no lightning strikes in those specific locations on the dates in question. When I discreetly asked my contact about this discrepancy, they admitted that the actual cause of ignition remained undetermined, and the lightning explanation was essentially a placeholder for something they couldn't explain. At this point, I knew I needed to return to the spring site, but this time with proper preparation. I borrowed specialized recording equipment from a former colleague now working in private industry, including a thermal imaging camera and an electromagnetic field detector. I also purchased a personal locator beacon that would transmit my coordinates to emergency services if activated. I returned to Tonto National Forest on May 8th, timing my visit to coincide with the new moon to maximize star visibility and natural darkness. I established a base camp at the same location as before, but planned to approach the spring site shortly after midnight, when Dr. Sandoval's data suggested the acoustic phenomena would be most active. At approximately 11:45 p.m., I began hiking toward the spring, following the same game trail as before. The night was clear and cool, around 58 degrees, with minimal wind. My equipment was functioning normally, and I maintained regular GPS waypoints on my backup device. As I approached the area where I had previously noticed the silence, I activated my recording equipment and proceeded with extreme caution. The transition was just as abrupt as I remembered. One moment surrounded by normal nocturnal forest sounds, the next in complete silence. My EMF detector immediately registered readings significantly above background levels, fluctuating in a pattern that matched the vibrations I had felt during my previous visit. My watch and primary GPS unit began malfunctioning, but my backup GPS continued working, though with reduced accuracy. As I neared the clearing with the spring, the air temperature dropped noticeably, at least 15 degrees within a few dozen yards. My thermal camera showed the ground around the spring was significantly colder than the surrounding forest, appearing as a dark blue circle against the warmer greens and yellows of the forest floor. More concerning was a vertical temperature anomaly that appeared as a cooler column extending upward from the spring into the night sky, visible only on the thermal display. I set up my equipment approximately 30 feet from the spring's edge, positioning the cameras and audio recorders to capture the entire clearing. As I worked, I began feeling the now familiar vibrations, stronger than during my daylight visit. My EMF detector's readings spiked dramatically, following the same 753 pattern I had noted before. At approximately 1:40 a.m., I observed a phenomenon that defied explanation. The surface of the spring's pool, which had been completely still, began to oscillate in geometric patterns, perfect concentric hexagons rippling outward from the center, despite there being no apparent physical cause for the disturbance. The thermal camera showed the water temperature was now below freezing, registering at 29.7 degrees Fahrenheit, yet it remained in liquid form. At 2:17 a.m., my audio equipment captured a series of sounds that were actually audible to my ears. Low resonant tones that seemed to come from beneath the spring, gradually increasing in volume and complexity. These sounds resembled nothing I've ever heard in nature, partly metallic, partly organic, with modulations that created an almost speech-like rhythm. The sequence lasted exactly 108 seconds before abruptly stopping. What happened at 2:43 a.m. is the reason I'm writing this. The air above the spring began to distort, similar to what I had glimpsed during my first visit, but far more pronounced. The distortion formed a vertical oval approximately 9 feet tall by 4 feet wide. Through this distortion, the opposite side of the clearing was no longer visible. Instead, I could see what appeared to be a corridor or tunnel illuminated by a diffuse bluish light. As I watched, paralyzed between scientific curiosity and mounting fear, a figure appeared in this apparent opening. At first, it was just a silhouette backlit by the blue light, but as it moved closer to the threshold between wherever that corridor was and the clearing where I stood, details became visible. The entity, I cannot bring myself to call it a person, was approximately 7 feet tall, with proportions that were almost, but not quite, human. Its limbs were too long, its torso too narrow. It appeared to be wearing some kind of fitted garment that covered its entire body, though in the thermal image, no distinction existed between this covering and what might have been its skin. Both registered as a uniform cold temperature. Most disturbing was its head, which was elongated and angular, with no visible hair or facial features I could discern except for what appeared to be large, slanted eyes that reflected the light from my headlamp when it turned toward my position. This reflection was unusual. Rather than the typical eyeshine of a nocturnal animal, it produced prismatic color separations, like light through a crystal. The entity remained at the threshold for approximately 20 seconds, seemingly observing the clearing. Then, it lifted what I presume was its hand and appeared to be manipulating something I couldn't see. Immediately, my equipment began to malfunction. Cameras shutting down, audio recorders emitting high-pitched feedback, my EMF detector displaying impossible readings before its screen went dark. I remained absolutely still, fighting every instinct to run. The entity then extended its arm toward the pool, and the water began to move upward, defying gravity to form a floating sphere approximately 2 feet in diameter. This sphere rotated slowly while maintaining its perfect shape, occasional ripples moving across its surface in those same hexagonal patterns. The vibrations I had felt earlier intensified to the point of pain, and I experienced a pressure inside my skull that made it difficult to maintain consciousness. Through this physical distress, I observed the entity step partially through the threshold, one limb extending to touch the floating sphere of water. Where it made contact, the water appeared to crystallize instantly, forming fractal patterns that emitted their own soft luminescence. At this point, my backup GPS unit emitted a loud alert tone, indicating its battery was critically low, though it had been fully charged when I began my hike. This sound seemed to startle the entity, which withdrew its limb and turned its attention directly toward my position. Though I was concealed in the shadows of the tree line, I had the distinct impression it could see me perfectly. The sensation that followed is difficult to describe. I experienced what felt like a probing of my mind, intrusive thoughts and images that were not my own, accompanied by emotions that ranged from clinical curiosity to something resembling alarm. I heard no voice, yet I perceived clear communication. I was not supposed to be there. I had witnessed something forbidden, and my presence had been detected by others who would now come. I felt rooted to the spot, unable to move or even look away, as the entity raised both limbs toward the distortion behind it. The oval rippled and expanded slightly, and I glimpsed movement beyond, additional figures moving toward the opening, their forms less distinct, but similar in their wrongness. What broke the paralysis was the sound of my personal locator beacon activating on its own, something that should have been impossible without manually pressing the emergency button. The high-pitched signal it emitted caused the entity to make a rapid movement, and the distortion in the air collapsed immediately, taking with it both the entity and the floating sphere of water. The spring's pool, which had been partially depleted by the levitated sphere, rapidly refilled as if water was being pushed up from below. I gathered what equipment would still function and retreated along the trail, moving as quickly as I dared in the darkness. The forest sounds gradually returned as I put distance between myself and the spring, but I couldn't shake the sensation of being observed. Twice I spotted unusual movement in my peripheral vision. Tall, thin shapes moving parallel to my path, but always disappearing when I turned to look directly. I reached my vehicle shortly before dawn and drove straight to Phoenix without stopping. In the following days, I discovered that most of my equipment had been rendered inoperable. The cameras and audio recorders that had shut down at the site would not power on again, and when I disassembled one camera, I found its internal components had been partially melted, with bizarre crystalline growths forming along the circuit boards. Only my backup GPS unit had continued functioning, and when I checked its data log, I discovered something impossible. According to its timestamp, what I had experienced as approximately 35 minutes, from 2:43 a.m., when the distortion appeared until my retreat, had actually been over 3 hours. The log showed my position had remained stationary from 2:43 a.m. until 5:52 a.m., more than 3 hours of missing time that I have no memory of. Even more disturbing was a series of coordinates recorded by the GPS during this period, locations where I apparently traveled while having no recollection of doing so. These coordinates form a perfect spiral pattern, extending outward from the spring before returning to my original position. The GPS data shows I covered nearly 2.7 miles during this spiral pattern, all while I believed I was standing stationary at the edge of the clearing. In the weeks since this encounter, I've experienced persistent after effects. I suffer from frequent migraines accompanied by visual disturbances, geometric patterns in my peripheral vision that resemble the hexagonal ripples in the water sphere. I've developed a sensitivity to certain sound frequencies that cause physical discomfort when encountered. Most concerning, I occasionally experience brief episodes of missing time, moments where I suddenly find myself in a different location, with no memory of how I got there, though these episodes typically span only minutes rather than hours. I've attempted to research further connections to historical incidents in the area, but have encountered unusual obstacles. Electronic records I had previously accessed regarding Paul Fugate's disappearance have been removed from databases or heavily redacted. Most alarming was my discovery that the game trail leading to the spring no longer exists. I attempted to return to the site last week, following the exact GPS coordinates from my previous visits, but found the landscape completely different. Dense vegetation and rock formations that made passage impossible, as if that section of forest had been deliberately altered, or my memories of the path were somehow false. Yesterday, I received an unmarked envelope at my home containing only a newspaper clipping from 1977 about the search for Paul Fugate. Someone had circled a quote from a search team member stating that tracking dogs had followed Fugate's scent to a specific location before uniformly refusing to continue. Handwritten in the margin were the GPS coordinates of the spring I had discovered, followed by the words, "They have been here longer than us." One final thing I think that's important to add is that during the moment when I felt that alien consciousness touched my mind, one clear image was transmitted to me. A network of tunnels extending for miles beneath the forest, connecting to larger chambers deep underground. These tunnels formed a pattern identical to the spiral path I apparently walked during my missing time. A pattern I've since recognized in ancient petroglyphs found throughout the Southwest, dating back thousands of years. Whatever dwells beneath Fossil Creek has been there for millennia, and I fear my intrusion has drawn its attention not just to me, but potentially to anyone who becomes connected to this information.
If you guys enjoyed today's stories, be sure to smack that like and subscribe button so you don't ever miss another episode of Secrets of the Woods. I'll see you all in the next episode.